The fog had not yet lifted from the lanes of East Haven when Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the early coach. The chill wrapped itself around her shawl like a question not yet asked, and the distant silhouette of St. Winifred's chapel rose through the gray, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She had not come on a whim. The envelope had arrived 3 days prior, slipped between pages of her gardening quarterly. A subtle hand, a careful placement. Inside was a single piece of parchment bearing the words. A candle was lit, but the altar stayed cold. The hymn book still remembers. M.C. No name, but enough. M.C. Marion Cross. A woman of delicate temperament and clipped grace. Once a governess in St. Mary Mead before moving to East Haven some 17 years ago. She had a son now, Samuel, and a quiet husband long since buried. Miss Marple had not heard from her since the boy was christened. For her to write now, and with such cryptic unease, meant something had been awakened, something Marion could not name, and no longer bear alone. The village itself had changed little. Ivy still claimed the low walls, and the chapel bell hung motionless, as if mourning something it hadn't yet confessed. Miss Marple was met at the gate by Reverend Hale, a thin man with a thoughtful brow and a voice so soft it seemed to apologize for itself. He welcomed her with hesitant warmth, but when she mentioned the letter, his eyes lowered, and he simply murmured, "It's better if you speak to Mrs. Cross directly." The Cross residence stood just behind the chapel, its windows framed with tired curtains and geraniums that leaned as if listening. Marion greeted her with a strained smile, and after the usual pleasantries were dispensed with, her health, the weather, a mutual acquaintance's unfortunate arthritis, Marion led her guest to the drawing-room. There, upon the tea tray, beside the untouched biscuits and a cooling pot, sat an unlit candle nestled in a pewter holder, and beside it a hymn book, old leather-bound, edges thinned with years of fingers. "It was left here," Marion whispered, "just like that, after evening prayers. No one saw who placed it." Miss Marple picked up the hymn book. The first pages were as one might expect, dedications, margins worn with penciled notes, but pressed between pages 73 and 74. "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy," was a folded note, not the one she had received, but older, yellowing, and faintly scorched at the edges. Its ink had faded, but still legible. "He hears the voices that do not sing." Marion flinched when Miss Marple read the words aloud. "Samuel has begun waking in the night," she said quietly, "screaming about a man in the loft. Says the man hums to him. Says he stands near the font when the light is gone." Miss Marple asked gently, "And has anyone else heard this humming?" Marion hesitated. "Lucy Arden said something similar, after choir practice. She's one of the sopranos. Her mother dismissed it as nerves." "And the candle?" Miss Marple asked, turning toward the unlit wax. Marion shivered slightly. "Samuel said if I ever lit it, the man would know he told." A silence fell between them, thick, steady, and without haste. Outside, a crow landed on the chapel spire, black against gray. Miss Marple, who had known many silences in her life, recognized this one. It was not fear of the present, but of the past returning, softly, like footsteps through a vestry floor. That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong. The choir's voices floated like mist across stone walls, but she could hear the tension, the strained breathing, the hesitant notes. Lucy Arden stood in the second row, eyes down, voice soft. When the final hymn ended, the stillness was so profound it seemed no one dared to exhale. And there, in the back pew, sat a boy she hadn't been introduced to. Samuel, presumably. His eyes met hers, wide, unblinking, ancient in a child's way. He did not smile, but she saw him mouth a word, silent as the shadows stretching across the nave. "Don't." Later that night, she returned to her small room at the Rose and Mirth Inn, the hymn book resting on the side table. As she prepared her evening tea, a soft sound met her ear, the faintest hum, low and melodic, echoing beneath the floorboards. Miss Marple did not look startled. She merely picked up her knitting, set the kettle to boil, and whispered to the silence, "I hear you, dear, but I do hope you're prepared to be heard in return." The following morning dawned with a pale, diffused light that bled through the fog like the ghost of a confession. Miss Marple walked to the chapel before the bells rang for morning prayer. The door was already ajar, as if the building itself anticipated her return. She passed quietly through the nave, the pews stretching like rows of weary witnesses, and made her way toward the rear, where the narrow staircase twisted upward to the choir loft. Few ever climbed there now. It had once been used for small ensembles during special services, weddings, Christmas, but now served more as storage, its pews layered in dust, and the cracked window panes groaning softly in the draught. She climbed slowly, taking in the details. The faint trace of candle wax near the banister, the worn groove where someone had often rested their hand. The loft smelled faintly of lavender and something older, like parchment burned long ago. On the floor, beneath the choir's worn bench, she found a small pile of scorched sheet music. Only one piece bore a name, Litany for a Hollow Psalm. No composer listed, no date, just a single annotation in the corner, scribbled in pencil, barely legible. Do not let them sing this. She turned toward the back corner of the loft, where the shadows thickened. A length of cloth had been nailed over a wooden panel, not to insulate, but to conceal. She gently pulled it back and ran her fingers across the frame. There was a gap, slight but purposeful, just enough for an eye or an ear. A listening hole. Looking through it revealed the baptismal font below and the first 3 pews, where the choir sat. So someone had watched from here. Not recently, but once. Often. Later that morning, she called upon Lucy Arden and her mother. They lived in a modest cottage down the lane, flanked by hedges grown wild with the season's indecision. Lucy, still pale, sat on the edge of a settee, while her mother, brisk and sharp-featured, prepared tea. Miss Marple asked about the music, about Samuel's fears, about the candle left unburnt. Lucy's fingers trembled slightly as she set her cup down. "We weren't supposed to look in the old hymnal cupboard," she whispered. "But we did, just for fun. And we found that music, the hollow psalm. Mr. Fenton said it wasn't suitable, too mournful. But Samuel said he heard someone humming it, said it came from the loft." Her mother interjected sharply. "Nonsense. Children imagine things. The choir loft hasn't been used in years." But Lucy's eyes held something deeper than childish fright, something lodged in the marrow, as if she'd glimpsed a truth no one had prepared her to bear. "He said it only comes when someone remembers," she whispered, barely audible. "That's why the candle was never lit." Back at the chapel, Miss Marple requested to speak with Mr. Fenton, the choir director. He was a tall man with sleeves always precisely rolled, hair perfectly parted, and a tone that seemed to resist interruption. When she mentioned the hollow psalm, he paused. Just a flicker, but in Miss Marple's eyes, it was all the confession she needed. "It's an old piece," he said, "from before my time. We don't use it. Not anymore." "Because it's cursed?" she asked dryly. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Because it invites silence where music should live. That hymn was sung only once, decades ago. Afterward, a boy collapsed in the choir pew. Never sang again. The page was torn out. The others were burned. But someone kept a copy," Miss Marple said softly, "and placed it in the loft." Mr. Fenton's jaw tightened. Some things are better left unsung. She studied him for a moment longer, then turned back toward the chapel door. "Yes," she murmured, "but others must be heard, or they begin to sing themselves." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her room. The hymn book lay where she had left it. As she turned the pages again, her eye caught something she hadn't noticed before. On page 73, beneath the ink of "Come, ye sinners," faint scratches appeared only at a certain angle, carved lightly with a needle or nail. For simple words, "He never left Marion." It was just past dawn when the sky over East Haven turned the pale color of old bone. Miss Marple returned to the chapel with deliberate steps and no company. She preferred her thoughts in silence and her observations uninterrupted. This time, she entered not through the main door, but through the vestry, where things meant to be forgotten were often stored, shelved, or quietly rearranged to gather dust. The room was still, as though even the sunlight hesitated to cross its threshold. On the shelf beside the altar candles, She noticed something that hadn't been there before. A folded piece of parchment tucked under the smallest brass holder, its edges faintly curled from heat. She opened it carefully. The paper had once been cream, now yellowed. The ink, faint but legible, carried the slow, deliberate pressure of a hand in used to confession. It read. He lit the candle and said the name. And then the voice came back. There was no signature, but below the words, in the corner, was a faint smudge of lavender ash. Miss Marple closed the note, folded it once more, and placed it in her handbag. She turned to find Reverend Hale standing in the doorway. He looked older in the morning light, his collar a bit too tight, his hands clasped as though they'd grown used to it over many long, silent years. "You've been investigating," he said with a tired sort of calm. "I've been listening," she replied. "There's a difference." He nodded, and she thought, just for a moment, that he might offer her something honest. But instead, he said, "The candle was never meant to be lit." Miss Marple met his eyes. "Because it calls something back." He hesitated. "Because it reminds someone they haven't left." She watched him closely. "Someone like Samuel?" Reverend Hale looked away, then nodded once. "I don't think he lied about the voice. I think he heard something. I think we all did once." Miss Marple left him in the vestry and walked out into the early morning frost. Children were gathering in the field beyond the rectory, bundled in scarves, tossing snow between rehearsed laughter and genuine joy. Lucy Arden sat apart, her sketchpad open on her lap. Miss Marple approached gently and asked what she was drawing. Lucy turned the book. The sketch was raw and hasty, but clear. A boy standing in the chapel loft, holding a candle. The flame bent sideways, as if moved by breath, though no one stood beside him. "That's Samuel," Lucy said softly, "from the day he fainted." Miss Marple sat beside her. "You were there." Lucy nodded. "He said the name, but it wasn't his own." "What name did he say, dear?" Lucy blinked slowly. "Marian." Miss Marple stilled. Marian Cross, Samuel's mother, the woman who had trembled only when her son spoke of dreams. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Marian again. This time, there was no tea prepared. Just a quiet living room and the sound of the clock marking time with a beat that felt oddly close to dread. "I believe your son spoke your name in the chapel," Miss Marple said gently, "when he lit the candle." Marian looked as though she had been struck. Her hands, normally folded with precision, now trembled in her lap. "He wasn't supposed to know," she whispered. "No one was." "Know what?" "That I was the one who hid to him. That I found it years ago, after Thomas died." Her voice cracked. "I thought if I took it away, he'd stop coming." "Thomas, my brother. He was older. Choir boy. He used to practice at night. That song, it haunted him. The hollow psalm. He thought it had a voice of its own. One night, he lit a candle at the font and said a name. And then he disappeared." Miss Marple listened carefully, feeling the weight of the confession settle like snow. "I found the music after he vanished. I buried it beneath the loft. But it kept coming back. Like the candle, it never truly went out." Miss Marple laid a hand on hers. "You tried to silence it to protect your son, but he found it, just like you did. The psalm always finds its voice again." That night, as the wind curled around East Haven like a question unanswered, Miss Marple returned to the chapel. She placed the broken pencil from Lucy's hymn book and the ash-marked note between the pages of the hollow psalm. And then she lit the candle on the altar, not to summon anything, but to bear witness. Behind her, the pipe organ gave the faintest wheeze, though no hands touched its keys. And she smiled, not in fear, but recognition. The dead do not always ask to return. Sometimes, they ask simply to be remembered. The following morning arrived like a breath held too long, gray, suspended, and expectant. The mist that usually shrouded the chapel grounds was thicker, clinging low to the grass, like a presence unwilling to rise. Miss Marple, after a quiet breakfast taken without appetite, returned once more to St. Agnes Chapel. She did not knock. Doors, she'd long believed, were only ever closed by those afraid of being found. Inside, the air held the weight of the night before. The candle she'd lit had long since burned down to a stub, The wax melted into a perfect disc that clung to the brass plate like a final punctuation. But what struck her was the smell, not of wax, not of wood, but of lavender and something more acrid beneath it. Smoke, not fresh, but lingering. Something, or someone, had been here since she last left. She noticed the faintest trace of footprints in the dust that edged the stone floor. Smaller than a man's, lighter than a woman's, a child's. They led from the altar to the corner where a locked cabinet stood, seldom used, its key long forgotten. But the lock had been disturbed, scratched, almost clawed. Miss Marple followed the trail to the cabinet and pressed her hand against the wood. Cold, not just from temperature, but from absence. Something once kept inside had been removed, or had found its way out. In the vestry, Reverend Hale waited, seated as if for confession. His eyes were fixed on a letter in his hands, aged, torn, and read too many times. Miss Marple sat without invitation. "You've remembered something," she said softly. He didn't lift his eyes. "I was a boy when Thomas disappeared. I was there. I was in the choir." Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing. He lit the candle at the font and spoke a name. He continued. "We thought he was being foolish, playing with ceremony. But then the chapel filled with the sound of, not music exactly, a hum, deep and low. He said it came from the hymn book itself. He said he could feel the song beneath the page." "What name did he speak?" The Reverend closed his eyes. "Marian, the name of his sister." Miss Marple sat straighter. "But Marian was a child at the time." "Yes, he said the hymn called her, that she was chosen." He opened the letter in his lap. This was written by Elias Kitt. He was the choir master then. It's a warning. He tried to burn the hollow psalm, said it was a conduit for something older than song. Miss Marple read the letter in silence. The final line struck cold. The voice behind the voice must never be allowed to echo. That afternoon, Lucy Arden fainted in the choir loft. Miss Marple, summoned quickly, found the girl conscious but glassy-eyed, her hands clutching a crumpled note. She had been humming, she said, and the candle at the altar had flared, though it was unlit. She'd heard a voice calling her name in her own voice. Miss Marple uncurled the note from Lucy's grip. It was a torn fragment of music, the hollow psalm, but this version was different. The key had shifted. The melody twisted slightly inward, like a mirrored reflection of itself. Written in a different hand, older, heavier, almost etched rather than penned. Back at the rectory, Miss Marple laid out all she had gathered. The original hollow psalm, the anonymous note from the vestry, Lucy's altered fragment, and Elias Kitt's letter. The pieces were part of the same composition, yet not. Someone had rewritten the hymn over time, distorting it, turning remembrance into ritual. That night, she asked Reverend Hale to call a meeting of the vestry and choir parents. When they assembled, she spoke not as an investigator, but as one who had simply listened longer than others. "This is not about ghosts," she said. "It's about grief, suppressed, rewritten, and sung until no one remembered why." She explained how Thomas had found the original hymn, believed it connected to his sister, and vanished. How Marian had buried the hymn out of fear, not guilt. How the choir had unknowingly kept singing traces of the hollow psalm, pieces of it bleeding into other compositions, like ivy into mortar. And how Lucy, through bloodline or song, had begun to echo the past. Miss Marple turned to the chapel doors. They opened without wind. The scent of ash returned. Someone, or something, still waited for the final note. The chapel stood quieter than usual the next morning, not merely hushed, but listening. A silence that was not absence, but anticipation. Miss Marple returned early, her footsteps softened by frost that glazed the stone like breath frozen mid-prayer. The sky above Whitmore Heath remained blank, an unbroken stretch of winter gray, and the yews bordering the chapel drooped under the weight of secrets too long kept. Lucy Arden had been ordered to rest, but the choir mistress, Miss Lyle, was already in the loft, sorting old hymnals with a furrowed brow and hands that trembled ever so slightly. When Miss Marple greeted her, she looked up as if awakened from a long dream. "I heard the harmony again last night," Miss Lyle whispered, "but it came from below, not the loft." below the altar. Miss Marple said nothing at first, only watched the way the dust moved around the woman's hands. "Have you ever heard of the forgotten refrain?" she asked. Miss Lyle's breath caught. "Only once. Years ago. The former choir master warned us never to speak of it. Said it wasn't truly a hymn. More like a pattern." In the rectory archives, Miss Marple had uncovered a single reference to the forgotten refrain, an unnamed melody, removed from all formal liturgical records, yet never destroyed, preserved by memory and fear. According to Elias Kitt's final letter, it had first been sung in 1884 during a private All Saints service. A boy collapsed mid-hymn and later described hearing someone behind his voice. After that, the piece was withdrawn from public use, its sheet music removed, but the melody survived, passed down in fragments, buried in harmonic echoes. Miss Marple now suspected that Thomas Wren, Agnes's younger brother, had pieced it back together, not from malice, but from longing. His sister had been his world. The music had promised connection, and perhaps, he believed, a door between life and what lies beyond. But that door had opened wider than intended. In the chapel's south wing, hidden behind velvet curtains, was the memorial alcove, the smallest part of the church, meant for private prayer. Miss Marple requested it be opened. Beneath the kneeler was a shallow hatch, and within it, dust-covered manuscripts, most torn, many blank. But among them, she found a hymnal inscribed with 3 initials, T.W.R. Thomas Wren. The hymn was there, entire, written in a minor key, with an uneven refrain that looped back on itself. It was not composed in praise, but in petition. That night, Miss Marple brought the hymn to Lady Agatha. They sat in the drawing room, the frost pressing against the panes, a single oil lamp warming the silence. Lady Agatha ran her finger over the worn notes, her face unreadable. "He sang it the night before he vanished," she whispered. "I was just upstairs. I thought it was a lullaby." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked. Lady Agatha shook her head. "No, it was a question, and I fear something answered." The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the chapel with Agnes and Reverend Hale. Together, they descended into the undercroft, a narrow stone corridor beneath the altar, sealed for decades. It was cold, still, almost preserved. In its center stood an old baptismal font, but unlike the one above, this was scorched. Around it were candle stubs, decades old, and in the dust, fresh footprints. Not one set, 2. Someone had been returning here. Someone still believed the refrain had power. Agnes stepped forward and laid her hand on the edge of the font. "He came here," she whispered. He called to her. Miss Marple did not correct her. Instead, she opened the hymn book and placed it on the font. "The melody isn't dangerous," she said softly. "What's dangerous is forgetting why it was sung." Because the forgotten refrain was never about summoning spirits or invoking curses. It was about grief. A grief that had curdled into something else when no one dared to name it. That night, for the first time in nearly 30 years, the chapel organ played the first few bars of the forgotten refrain. Only the first few. No voices joined it. No echo replied. And yet, as the last note drifted upward, something in the old rafters shifted. The air no longer clung. The silence no longer watched. The following morning dawned heavy with fog, wrapping Whitmore Heath in a pale, breathless stillness. No birdsong broke the air. It was as though even nature had paused to listen. Miss Marple walked to the chapel alone, her boots making no sound on the frost-laced path. She held a small envelope in her gloved hand, the kind used for condolence notes. It had been slid under her door at the Rose and Mirth. Inside was a single name, scrawled in trembling ink, David Bly. The name had not been mentioned by Lady Agatha, nor by Reverend Hale, but in the church registry, long tucked away behind parish notices and wedding records, Miss Marple found the boy's baptism, dated 2 years before Thomas Wren's disappearance. No mention of death, no family listing, just the name, the date, and a note that read, voiced in silence. In the vestry, the air was thick with old beeswax and newer unease. Reverend Hale stood near the window, hands clasped. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "Do you believe grief leaves behind shadows?" She answered with a small nod. "Only when the light refuses to turn and face it." He hesitated, then admitted he had once overheard Agnes and her brother arguing in the music room. Long ago, before the scandal. Thomas had mentioned a name, David, and Agnes had wept. The next morning, she claimed no memory of it. Miss Marple asked if he'd ever heard of Elias Kitt, the former choirmaster. Hale stiffened. "A tragic figure," he said, "dismissed during a time when the church preferred shadows to confessions." His tone betrayed both pity and buried fear. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Undercroft, this time alone. A single candle lit her way, its flame faint against the damp. She knelt by the font, now cleared of the hymn book, and brushed away the ash that lingered across the stone floor. Beneath it, etched faintly into the stone, was a name, David, no surname, no date, just a child's name, carved by a hand that had trembled. She pressed her gloved fingers against it. It was no vandal's work. It had been done slowly, reverently, perhaps by Thomas himself. David Bly had not disappeared. He had been hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of shame. Later, over tea with Agnes, Miss Marple asked gently, "Did you love your brother Agnes?" Agnes looked away. "More than I could say, but I did not understand him." "Did he harm David?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Agnes whispered. "He tried to protect him. From the village, from the church, from our father." She paused, then confessed the truth. David had been the result of a silence too shameful to speak aloud. Lady Agatha's husband had fathered him with a girl from the servants' quarters. When the truth threatened to surface, the child was hidden in the chapel, raised in secrecy by Thomas and Elias Kitt. But one night the boy took ill, frightened, fevered, calling for a name he barely understood. By morning, he was gone. They buried him in the Undercroft, beneath a name only Thomas could carve. The grief broke Elias. It broke Thomas, too. But Thomas didn't disappear, Miss Marple said gently. He was sent away, banished for what he knew. Agnes nodded, tears falling soundlessly. And I did nothing. I let them silence him. Miss Marple did not speak. The truth had already done its work. That evening, the choir gathered again, but Lucy Arden did not sing. Instead, she read aloud the opening bars of a hymn no longer forbidden. The church was still reverent, not in guilt, but in acknowledgement. In the front pew, Agnes sat beside Lady Agatha. Their hands did not touch, but their silence no longer separated them. As the final verse faded, a sudden wind swept through the chapel, lifting the candle flames for a single breath. No windows were open. No one stirred. But Miss Marple, watching from the loft, smiled faintly. Some names, when spoken, set more than voices free. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, reverent quiet, as if the village itself were learning how to breathe again. But Miss Marple knew that not all truths lie dormant once unearthed. Some shift, some echo, and some resist their final verse. Though Agnes had confessed and the parish had listened, there still lingered something unresolved, something in the way the choir loft creaked at night, or how the wind whispered through the chapel as if passing through the remnants of a song long abandoned. It was Lucy who came to Miss Marple one morning with trembling fingers wrapped around a note she had found tucked inside her choir book. It was folded with deliberate care, and on its back was drawn the same fragile symbol Miss Marple had seen burned faintly into the parchment pages beneath the chapel floor. A treble clef looped with a single, falling tear. The message inside was brief. Rehearsal ends when the silence listens. No name. No date. Miss Marple brought the note to Reverend Hale, whose face turned the color of bone. That was Elias Kitt's sign, he admitted, voice thin. He would draw it beside every hymn that was never meant to be sung. Music that held sorrow too deep for voices to carry. A quiet shadow passed between them. The note was not a warning, it was an invitation. That night, Miss Marple asked to visit the choir loft once more. The vicar hesitated but agreed. Together, they ascended the narrow staircase, lantern in hand. The wood moaned under their weight. Cobwebs shimmered in the glow like old lace. The air was thick with incense not burned in decades, and faintly, Like something remembered rather than heard, came a breath of melody. At the far end of the loft was an old music stand, unused for years. Beneath it, Miss Marple found what she had expected, a small wooden case, its hinges rusted but intact. Inside lay 3 items, a silver tuning fork, a child's white glove, and the final page of Thomas Wren's Lost Lullaby, inscribed not in ink but in charcoal. Its lines trembled, broken near the edges, but the final notation held, for solemn chords followed by a rest that stretched longer than any measure ought. "This is the end," Miss Marple whispered. Below, Lucy and the other choir children had gathered, summoned not by command but instinct. No rehearsals had been announced, and yet here they were, holding their books, silent but expectant. Reverend Hale descended and, for the first time in years, led them to sing not from tradition, but from memory. They sang the forgotten lullaby, Thomas's gift, David's requiem, Elias's plea. And as the notes floated upward, something in the chapel shifted. Not a gust, not a miracle, but a lightness, as if the air itself exhaled after a long, mournful breath. When the final note faded, Lucy closed her hymnal. Her eyes glistened, but she did not weep. She looked up at Miss Marple in the loft, and for the first time, smiled without fear. The next day, Miss Marple met with Lady Agatha one last time. They sat in the winter garden where the frost had just begun to lift. The elder woman listened in silence as Miss Marple recounted all that had been uncovered. When it was done, Lady Agatha did not protest or question. She merely rose, walked to the chapel, and placed a single lily at the foot of the organ bench. It was white, yes, but its petals curled like parchment, edges singed with memory. The truth had been sung, not loudly, not triumphantly, but clearly, finally, and without shame. The early morning fog had lifted, but a hush still clung to the village, thin, expectant, like a curtain not yet drawn. Miss Marple, never one to indulge in melodrama, nonetheless found herself walking the chapel path, with a sense of finality pressing gently upon her steps. The choir's haunting reprise of the lullaby lingered in her ears, not merely as music, but as memory unsealed. The dead, it seemed, had not returned to haunt. They had waited to be heard. It was Lucy who approached her that morning in the courtyard, her fingers curled around an old sheet of music that looked as though it had been folded and hidden for years. "I found this in my robe pocket," she said softly, "but no one's used that wardrobe since before I was born." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The page was yellowed, the ink faded, but there it was again, that quiet, deliberate symbol, the treble clef looped with a single falling tear. Below it, in smaller writing, were words that hadn't appeared in any hymn book. The name must be sung to be lifted. There were no initials, no date, but the melody scrawled beneath was unmistakably the closing refrain of Thomas Wren's lullaby, only now, with 4 extra measures, and in the margin, a single word repeated over and over, David, David, David. Miss Marple took the page to Reverend Hale. He paled as he read it, not with fear, but with something approaching awe. "No one should have known that name," he whispered. "Not the children, not even Lucy." He confessed that after the scandal, the boys' records had been struck from the register. It had been the parish's shame, their silence, their secret, but it had not been forgotten. Not by the house, not by the loft, and certainly not by the music. Miss Marple requested a quiet meeting with Lady Agatha, Reverend Hale, and the remaining senior members of the vestry. She laid the page on the chapel table and spoke plainly. "This boy," she said, pointing to the name, "was buried not with ceremony, but with shame. His requiem was left unfinished, and his name erased from ink, but not from the walls." Lady Agatha, pale beneath her veil, finally bowed her head. "I was there," she said quietly. "I saw him once." Elias knelt beside him. He was not praying for forgiveness. He was asking permission to let him go. "And did we?" Miss Marple asked. There was no reply. That evening, Miss Marple returned once more to the choir loft. The children gathered again, not by command, but by something older, something drawn not from discipline, but instinct. They held their hymnals not in fear, but in grace. Miss Marple handed the final sheet to Lucy. "Sing his name," she said gently. And she did. Softly, clearly, beautifully. As if the name had waited only for her voice to come home. Down below, the old chapel organ hummed for the first time in months, unprompted, its pipes echoing the final 4 notes as though Thomas himself had written them in the silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened, not for what was played, but for what had ended. Not a haunting, not a curse, but an unfinished song now whole. The dawn that followed felt unlike the others that had preceded it. It came not with fanfare or color, but with a kind of stillness that suggested something had shifted. Outside the chapel, dew clung to the grass as though nature herself was unwilling to let go of the tears left behind the night before. Inside, the air held that faint scent again, not of dust or decay, but of lavender warmed by time. Miss Marple arrived before the choir, before even the early sacristan, and paused in the nave beneath the stone archway where David Bligh's name had once been scratched out. Now, faintly, almost apologetically, it was beginning to show again, etched softly by age, moisture, or perhaps conscience. Lady Agatha met her at the altar steps, wrapped not in mourning, but in an unspoken gratitude. "It wasn't his music that haunted us," she said in a voice made older by remembrance. "It was ours. Our silence. Our refusal to name the note." Miss Marple did not reply. She simply handed her the final page of the reconstructed lullaby, restored from Elias Kitt's fragments, Lucy's margins, and what memory dared supply. "You must lead the dedication," she said gently. "You held the silence longest. Let it be you who breaks it." By noon, the small chapel was filled, not with spectators, but with witnesses, those who had whispered of David, of Elias, of Lady Agatha's sorrow, and of the music once forbidden. Children filed in, not in strict rows, but shoulder to shoulder, as if understanding that this was not ceremony, but something far more human. Reverend Hale spoke only briefly. "Today, we remember a boy who should never have been forgotten, a song that should never have been silenced, a truth that should never have been buried." His voice trembled only once, on the word buried, and Miss Marple's glance caught his, offering a reassurance that needed no words. Lucy began the first verse. Her voice was clearer now, lifted not by perfection but by release. Each note rose upward through the chapel rafters, wrapping around old beams and faded banners. Mr. Fenton joined at the second refrain, his baritone no longer guarded. Others followed, the children, then the older parishioners. By the final verse, even Lady Agatha was singing, softly, through tears, and as the last note lingered in the air, not fading, but gently placing itself in the silence, a beam of sunlight passed through the east window and struck the wooden whistle Elias once left on the altar. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Afterward, Miss Marple walked alone around the chapel grounds. The garden had begun to bud early, a sign of change or forgiveness. She did not know. By the old ash tree, where the forgotten name had once been whispered only by wind and birds, a plaque had been quietly placed. Not grand, not ornate, just David Bligh, 1957 to 1967. Let there be light. She paused before it and allowed herself, for once, a sigh. Not of fatigue, but of something quieter, closure. Then she turned and began the slow walk back toward the village, toward tea, and toward whatever whisper of truth might come next. The village of Whitmore Heath had always prided itself on a kind of decorous stillness, the hedges well trimmed, the brass polished, the past quietly folded away like old lace. But in the days that followed the requiem, something imperceptible began to stir. The chapel door, once opened only for liturgy, was now visited in quiet intervals by townsfolk who had never before sung, never questioned, never paused to wonder what stories the stones beneath their feet remembered. And at the center of it all, unnoticed by many but felt by all, was the change Miss Marple had quietly left in her wake. Lady Agatha Wren, for decades a figure of refined remove, now walked the chapel grounds daily, her cane tapping softly in rhythm with thought. She had taken it upon herself to catalogue the remaining pieces of David Bligh's music, the sketches, fragments, and unfinished lullabies that Elias Kitt had once rescued from ash and time, not to publish, nor to display, but to preserve. Some truths, she told Miss Marple over tea, are not for noise, but for knowing. Mr. Fenton, the choir master, had begun retraining the choir, not in precision, but in intention. No more emphasis on perfect pitch, but rather on the meaning behind every word. He had placed the whistle on the chapel's inner sill, beneath the stained glass. There it remained, unplayed, not out of fear, but reverence. Lucy Arden, once hesitant and withdrawn, had grown into her voice like ivy settling over stone, not quickly, but with quiet certainty. She now helped with the village children's choir, teaching them not only notes, but the stories beneath them. She sang David's lullaby sometimes in rehearsals, letting it breathe in corners of the room where grief had once lingered. He wasn't just a ghost, she said once when asked. He was a boy, and boys deserve to be remembered as more than shadows. And Miss Marple, never one for spectacle, declined all invitations to speak at dedications, anniversaries, or civic acknowledgments. Instead, she returned to her garden in St. Mary Mead, where the first crocus had begun to split the soil. The letter that had started it all, pale, creased, and unsigned, she tucked away in a drawer beneath her teacups. Some memories, she believed, belonged next to porcelain, where they could rest undisturbed but never lost. But on the morning of Easter Sunday, a small parcel arrived by post. Inside, a single bell chime, recorded and pressed into a phonograph disc, and a note in Lady Agatha's hand. He rang it, just once. For David. For himself. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The bell tower, sealed for years, had found its voice again, not to mourn, but to mark the passage of silence into peace. As she poured herself a fresh cup of tea, the window beside her caught the breeze. It carried the scent of early lavender, and with it the faintest echo of a melody now sung in full, a lullaby, a requiem, a truth reclaimed. And as Miss Marple stirred her tea, she thought not of endings, but of echoes, how they linger, not to haunt, but to remind. For in the village of Whitmore Heath, the past no longer lay buried beneath ash and silence. It had risen, note by note, voice by voice, until it could be named, mourned, and finally freed.